Hi there. This is my reaction, review, breakdown, analysis thing for House of the Dragon Season 2, Episode 5, Regent. To start out with, I'm sorry I'm getting this out so late on Saturday, that, as you can probably tell from my voice, I'm recovering from a cold I had earlier in the week, starting on Monday, that the hacking and sneezing so much, I couldn't really record then, so I had to wait until my voice recovered enough. So if I sound a little scratchy in this, you'll know why. Bear with me, I'm sorry. But the way I go about this is I try to focus my analysis on the top 7 most notable points about an episode, because 7 is a good number. 7 most notable points, either good or bad. Just 7 different topics. To start with, point 1. This is a setup episode, much like episode 3 was a setup episode, with less action but more politics, plot developments, and characterization. And with that as its set goal, it achieved what it set out to do. That we've seen people criticizing episode 3 and now episode 5 so much for it wasn't a season premiere with a bunch of action scenes in it or a dragon battle. What I'm looking for is competency of execution. That this is just that part in the story arc, that you need an even balance of those. If it was just spectacle all the time, like the late Game of Thrones seasons, it wouldn't make sense. That this isn't just, the fluff we have to get through, that this is a lot of setup, of the politics that we missed from the early Game of Thrones seasons, the scheming, when they were pretty much just copying the plot of the books. That's half the fun. Thankfully, I've seen other major review things like Red Team Review, Preston Jacobs, a couple of other ones, Charles. Just, guys, this isn't slow. This is the setup you need to have more battles like that. There's not going to be a dragon battle literally every episode. I mean, there's going to be a battle maybe every 4th or 5th episode, and I expect that. Does that mean that the dragon battle episode was a better episode? I mean, even I admit it was more enjoyable, but you could have, a C rating for a battle episode that was very flawed, versus a setup episode could be an A if it was done really well. Like if you have a flop battle, like the White Hunt in Season 7 of Game of Thrones or something. It's, obviously I'm more interested in the climax ones, but this is what sets those up. So I'm grading this on, was it good in its capacity as a setup episode? I think it was. It was pretty tightly written. There was stuff for all the characters to do. I'll get into that. But just point 1 here on the nature of the episode as a setup. I actually have subpoints. That was point 1A. That, dude, it's a setup episode. Tied to that, 1B, is the specific screenwriter. I'm excited that this is the first time that T. Mickle was officially credited with an episode script. For years, Mickle has been George R. R. Martin's personal writing assistant and his representative in the House of the Dragon writer's room. Red Team Review, Carmine said he was a little confused by this. Was she just a personal assistant? Go for it. No, she's a writing assistant. For years, he's called her my minion, who he sends to agents, that is his representative in the writer's room, that she is part of the creative process. And yeah, I know, mind-blowing, this show has an actual writer's room, where there are formal meetings around a table and discussions. Whereas Game of Thrones, they officially said, we don't even have formal meetings, it's just the 2 of us and our 2 guys who work for us, that we assumed they were having discussions, even between themselves, and they weren't. Where they go, we just passed the script back and forth to each other. That there weren't meetings, there wasn't a full writing staff. So because this show actually has writers' room meetings with 8 to 9 people in it, Mickle was always sitting in on those as Martin's representative, so she has been part of the creative process since Season 1. She just wasn't credited with a specific script, but she was part of the discussion on it. And it's no surprise that as Martin's representative, I've seen multiple reviewers saying this episode feels like a gift to the book fans, or it feels like it was written by a book fan. Yeah, it was written by Martin's writing assistant. That it feels like a mid-season 2 episode is something I've seen a lot of people say, that it feels like one of those politics scheming plot building episodes from mid-season 2. Yeah, because most of those small council scenes in season 2 were lifted straight from the book, or condensing something from the book, that it's just, that's Martin's style. That's what the story is supposed to be like when they're following it. And another thing, you can tell there are a lot of Easter eggs in this episode for book readers. Not even Easter eggs, they're not like, I hate it when they have an Easter egg where it's just prominently name-dropping lore that isn't relevant. Like, for example, during Sam Tarly's stay at the Citadel, they name-dropped something about Lodos and the Ironborn, which, oh, you're as silly as Lodos' prophecies, and that has nothing to do with this actual plot. At the same time, there's a lot of details about the Citadel, because there are chapters set in the Citadel that they didn't mention. Like, this is a random Easter egg from an unrelated storyline versus actual world building of the books, of giving more details about the Archmaesters and the Citadel, the Seneschal, all of that. Really, they weren't trying to actually fill in. This isn't even Easter eggs, that they're filling in the details with really specific, just geographic references. That you can tell Mikkel was writing scenes set at Harrenhal where they're talking about local villages and towns we might get supplies from, and she name-dropped a lot of proper names, proper nouns that are straight from the book, and things I had to look up, not even, like, prominent things. Like, even in the other scenes to an extent, like when Rhaenyra is at her small council and they're talking about army movements, that these are places that would be on a map, like send swords and supplies to Maidenpool in case Kristen's army turns north, but then it didn't. Well, yeah, Maidenpool is a prominent place on a continent-scale map, but the Harrenhal stuff where they're listing off Lambswold, Riverbend, maybe we can get some smiths from Nutton, very obscure. Those are like from Brienne and Arya chapters when they're in the Riverlands, of just local towns near the Inn of the Kneeling Man. And this isn't just trivia, it's not just, hyper-specific name-dropping. It's Easter eggs are, like, when you do Easter eggs the wrong way, it's name-dropping lore to cover up that we didn't, like, Season 7 didn't really represent the Citadel story very well. Versus this is someone actually bothered to do the research of what are local towns in and around Harrenhal. Reminds me of the one Jaime chapter in the 5th book, because it's most about the other set of characters. The one Jaime chapter, he goes to Raventree Hall to negotiate the surrender of the Blackwoods. And that chapter is filled with a lot of new references because they're negotiating a surrender. Jaime and Lord Blackwood going over a map and discussing specific towns, valleys, and mills that he has to give up as part of the surrender. So it's zooming in on the local level that gives you a better sense of the scale, that Westeros is this entire continent, and there's 7 kingdoms. It's not just the 8 or 9 great houses, or even the top tier, the second tier vassals like the Blackwoods or the Manderleys have their own third tier vassals, the little guys like the Cassells and stuff. And under them are just villages and towns, that it makes the world feel bigger. Like in Star Wars terms, if they just kept referring to Tatooine as if it was one location and not a planet filled with many smaller locations. That, I'm going to Tatooine. Are you going to Mos Espa? Are you going to the Dune Sea? There's more than one city on the planet. Things like that, that when you just name-dropping little village names. And there is a balance that you don't want to overburden the audience with too much exposition speak. But just, this is meant to, it's not even insisting on itself. It's stray dialogue bothering to give a name for, the village and the town. Makes the world feel more realized. It is a balancing act, but it's what Game of Thrones failed at, when it was just, no, we have to appeal to soccer moms and football players. Strip it to the bare bone of only the bare minimum of proper names so people don't get overwhelmed. It's that kind of show, guys. But going back to, and this is the real crux of what I'm talking about here, apart from, dude, it's a setup episode. What I don't think a lot of people have discussed is having writers like T. Mikkel on this, a relatively new writer. This goes back to the broader comparisons between episodes 3 and 5. As setup episodes, They were both written by relatively new writers. Episode 3 was written by David Hancock, but again, relatively new because while technically his first script, he was present in the writer's room with T and everyone else through most of season 1, is that Hancock was the script continuity editor. And that's how you're supposed to work your way up to be a writer. You start out as a writing assistant, editor, then work your way up. As opposed to what Brian Cogman did, where that's what we thought he meant, and later he clarified, oh no, I'm like their personal gopher valet assistant, and then they, with no prior writing training, they made me a staff writer, and you're not really supposed to do that. Those are his words. That there has to be a way for new writers to work their way up the ranks and gain experience. That what I'm getting at is that this touches on the wider issues that led to the Writers Guild of America strike last year. Remember that? The biggest complaint wasn't just, oh, it's artificial intelligence. The biggest complaint was that the studios weren't willing to pay for full writers' rooms, or to pay to train new writers, or train them in the production process. That paid training time on going to set and learning how all the set building and production works, so you know how it functions when you're writing scenes to fit in with that instead of unfilmable things. That George R. R. Martin himself had a really great blog post at the time. I made a whole video about it, going over how, he's a TV veteran. He was working on the 1980s Twilight Zone and Beauty and the Beast, and remarking on it, this is before the 1988 strike even. This was the third strike he's been through, and he said, late 80s, they had entire training programs, and there were established ranks that you worked up from, writer to co-executive producer to executive producer, because they understood you need to train people to do something, and in the past 30 years, they just cut corners everywhere. That they had this thing, if we don't need a full writer's room, we'll have a mini room of just 3 people, or even just one showrunner. They kind of believe the studios believe their own propaganda, that no, one super showrunner, one J.J. Abrams, Damon Lindelof type, is capable of doing the job of a dozen people, and we don't need to train other people, and accepting as a given that, okay, maybe he is capable of doing all that writing work. How are you going to make a new J.J. Abrams? That there are, accepting that he knows all of this, and he's one guy can do that, which they really can't. Where are new writers supposed to come from if you need yours? It just led to studios bidding on the same small pool of celebrity top-level showrunners. And yes, this is the environment that allowed people like Benioff and Weiss to thrive, that they said, we only need one super user guy. Accepting all of that. It's the old catch-22 that, well, you need job experience to get this entry-level job. You goddamn sociopath. No, it's just, there are no entry-level writers. It's just, oh, we cut those out. Now it's just showrunners. So where do showrunners come from if you've eliminated the intervening step where people have to start out somewhere? This is the other system where, well, below writer, we have writer's assistants. And I don't mean their gopher and their valet. I mean someone who is doing script continuity checks. That there are people in the room, like the one time we actually saw video of a table read for Game of Thrones. There's assistants all over the place, but you have to actually trust them to be the continuity editor. So they work their way up from that, and not just I promote up my friends, but this is a job, an established position, that then works up to we're actually crediting you with a full script. Because script writing is a collaborative process. I mean, it's not as if Hancock and Mickle came up with full ideas in this. They write like on the level of dialogue. Larger scale things like what's going to happen at Rook's Rest, or Rhaenyra disguising herself as a Septa to meet Alicent, those are things Ryan Condal came up with, like it or not. And I didn't think it was too big of a problem, but those large scale story arcs, that's something they come up with. But the level of just script dialogue that they gradually worked up from script editor, Martin's representative, to credited with a full script. This is the right way to do this to develop a bigger talent pool. Case in point, Ira Parker started out as, well, he was a writer on The Last Ship. In this, he came in and he wrote the well-received script for episode 4 back in season 1. Now, Ira Parker has left this to go be the showrunner on the Dunk and Egg series, which is filming right now. So this is building a wider pool of writers like David Hancock, T. Mickle to an extent, of these will be the writers we let do other things in this series or maybe in some of the other ones they're planning in the expanding World of Westeros cinematic universe. That this is how you get people started out, that the new writers you give the less critical setup episodes in between episodes, and then the really critical ones like the season premieres, the finales, the dragon battles, that's what the showrunner personally writes. So this is the right way to do that, it's expected, and I thought they both did a good job. But moving on from that, in terms of this is a setup episode with these are decent new writers, that's all point 1. Point 2 out of 7. This had the most different locations and subplots in a House of the Dragon episode so far, which was pretty notable. That we reached a new high of 6 separate locations. Possibly more if you split up the subplots by character, but this is notable to me because of just how focused season 1 was. There were time skips, it was separated chronologically, not temporally, that in terms of locations, it was almost entirely concentrated just around King's Landing, Dragonstone, and nearby Driftmark. And all of these are on Blackwater Bay, and it's all dealing with just the royal family, not entirely different families and sets of characters. Well, one big extended family. So it is mostly concentrated in that. We rarely had a season 1 episode with more than 3 locations. Like, briefly, I think we had a 4th one in the wedding episode when we saw the Vale at Runestone, but it was really concentrated, and as for King's Landing, it was mostly just the Red Keep, or people from the Red Keep absconding to a brothel, not other sets of characters. Season 2 has been widening out a bit. Season 2 premiere rose to 5 locations, that core trio, plus the Wall, then Shipbreaker Bay. And the reason I'm stressing all this is I'm actually specifically reacting to something that the writer said in an interview, where after the season premiere of, wow, we're seeing the Wall, and we're seeing other stuff, Condell and his team said, don't think this is going to be the world-spanning thing Game of Thrones was. It's not. And that makes sense, because it's not Daenerys in the Eastern Continent, Jon Snow at the Wall, there isn't a Wall storyline as such. But, direct quote, they said, the 4 corners that Season 2 is built around are King's Landing, Dragonstone, Driftmark, and now Harrenhal, because Daemon is at Harrenhal, and that's where, like, the Riverlords will come to him to represent all of the Riverlords storyline. That makes sense, but they said just these 4, so I'm happy when it does expand beyond just those 4, that we got a 5th and 6th thing this episode, that we had side trip to the Twins for the first time for the prequel phrase, we had a side trip to the Eyrie to see Jane Eyre for the first time. So, yeah, there were 6 different physical locations. And on top of that, this is splitting hairs, not going to get into it too much, of what if one character visits 2 locations, like Kristen Cole's army goes to Duskendale, then Rook's Rest, but I count that as one storyline. But then again, King's Landing is technically one big location, but I think at this point we should split that between the Red Keep and the Royals, and Season 2 has introduced small folk locations, the small folk stuff with Hugh, with Ulf at the tavern and everything. Those are recurring locations they're going to do with the tavern, so I guess there's 2 Red Keep, Flea Bottom stuff, but still, the point is, the show is widening out, and this is pretty much the most different places we've ever been. Another reason I'm bringing this up is my favorite Game of Thrones episode, or easily my top 5, but what I usually cite as my favorite, is the 5th episode of Season 3, Kissed by Fire. Notably not written by Benioff and Weiss, but by Cogman, who, as one script, could focus on it more. That is my gold standard for how well an episode is able to juggle this dense book with multiple POV character groups. Kissed by Fire had 7 different locations in it, all of which, while not a critical season premiere, season finale, every storyline significantly advanced in it. Incrementally, but significantly. Like, Robb beheads Lord Karstark, Jon has sex with Ygritte. For Daenerys, it was the episode Grey Worm was introduced. Arya saw Beric fighting the Hound. That just pretty much every major storyline. There were 7 major storylines, each of which felt significant in Kissed by Fire, and I still point to that as how well they're able to juggle it. And admittedly, there won't be as many in House of the Dragon. Even in the source material Fire and Blood, it's focused on the Targaryens, but they go to other fronts in the war. I mean, eventually they're setting up Daemon and the Reach front of the war. They've mentioned Dalton Greyjoy, that we're not going to be in the north with the Starks at the Wall, I get that, but they're setting up that the Stark army is coming south, but it merges, that the Winter Wolves, the Stark advanced force, joins the army of the River Lords. It's one big army, so it is one subplot, but that's a whole other set of characters we're waiting on. Like, they mentioned Ben Blackwood exists, thankfully, and so hopefully he'll come up later, or Oscar Tully got introduced. That this is this whole other set of characters who maybe you could lump together and call the Harrenhal storyline. Let's be honest, Driftmark pretty much overlaps with Dragonstone. They're really close islands. I mean, you can see one from the other practically, but we went from really one set of characters on King's Landing who at times visit Dragonstone in Season 1 to now basically 3 major, arguably 4 major locations, with Team Black, Team Green, and then what's going on at Harrenhal. So obviously these other things, it was a one scene with Jane Arryn, which was under 2 minutes, a little under 2 minutes, but I really liked it. Like, you could tell thought went into this, that in terms of the scripting and acting, it was just a short dialogue scene, but it was really detailed and nuanced, and I really liked it. Jace visiting the Freys wasn't just fan service, it was advancing his storyline, and the geopolitical stuff, setup of everything was politics. So they were short and introducing new characters, but it was a different set of things. I liked it. So they're really expanding out from this. Now, we didn't see Adam and Alan in this episode, or Ulf, but we did get a lot of the focus on Hugh and then the small folk. I'll get to that. But in terms of different sets of characters, I mean, yeah, Hugh's thing counts as a different storyline to me, so arguably 7 different running storylines, but not as significant as there was like 10 minutes on each storyline in Kissed by Fire. The 5th and 6th thing had like 2 minutes each, but it's widening out. That I want them to make a prequel it's a bit more than just the Targaryens, and I know and accept that they said, look, the main characters are Rhaenyra, Alicent, and Daemon, but for book readers, like, we like Oscar Tully, Kragan Stark, Jane Arryn, and Daemon and stuff, and we don't want it to be concentrated to the point you're cutting out characters. So I hope they widen it out, that we have this Vale storyline now. We'll see where they go with that. But it's not as many full subplots as Kissed by Fire, but it's moving in the right direction, that it widened out like that. And just for people saying this was a slow setup episode moving between different set of characters, I understand that, but another thing that occurred to me, I'm going to spin off into a different video. This was the first episode of House of the Dragon in which no one died on screen. Not even unnamed extras. Which I didn't feel made it slow. There is that crowd scene, when I was talking about the small folk, there is that crowd scene, but that wasn't a full-on riot yet. And just how rare it is that there have been 3, arguably 4 episodes of Game of Thrones in which no one died out of 73 episodes, and even then there was like a fight scene, like Jaime fighting Brienne. No one died in that episode, but it was still an action scene. That it's an action-y show, so it's memorable when there's an episode where no one dies. And they even have Simon Strong spell this out at Harrenhal, where both sides are pausing to lick their wounds after the mutually destructive Battle of Rook's Rest. Pausing and thinking of what to do next. So that makes sense. I'm going to have a whole separate video on the trivia of that. If no one died, it was a setup episode, but it juggled different storylines, expanding out beyond just the Rhaenyra Alicent show, which are still prominent, and I liked all of that. So those are the first 2 points. Could have gone longer. I'm going to split off the rest of that. Point 3, and this is when I start getting into plot specifics. Point 3 out of 7. The Velaryon characters all got the focus in this episode that they somewhat lacked in the first half of the season. That is point 3. It's arguably the biggest point of the episode. The rest was just set up for this. And this is very significant. I've bolded this in my notes here, that if you saw my review for episode 4, please back me up on this in the comments. And for those of you who watched my last review, the final point, 7th point I left off on as sort of a mid-season reflection, I said, we're at the halfway point, and my only complaint, semi-complaint so far, is that the Velaryon characters have had at least one decent scene per episode, but overall, their storylines have been backburnered these 4 episodes. But I understand why. That obviously the A-plots were for 2 episodes dealing with the Blood and Cheese assassination, and then 2 episodes leading up to and then showing the Battle of Rook's Rest, that they wouldn't be the A-plots in that. And we could tell they're laying groundwork with a scene here, a scene there. Here's Rhaena going somewhere. Here's Adam and Alan being introduced. Short stuff that we hoped was leading to something. It followed through completely on that promise, and I ended by saying I assume, or at least hope, that the Velaryon characters will shift into focus in the second half of the season. They followed through on that now. They did that. By the Velaryon characters, I mean specifically Baela, Rhaena, Corlys, as well as Jace, because he's a Velaryon and because he's Baela's betrothed. But those 4 characters I felt weren't used enough. Jace had some to do in the first episode, but, Rhaena didn't even talk until the 3rd episode, but then is actually getting her own subplot now. So, going through that, they followed through on, we're shifting focus to the Velaryons now, who were a little underused in the first half. I don't blame them for that, it's just the way the narrative flowed. So different subplots by those 4 characters in this. I'll say it right now. This was Baela Targaryen's episode. You can quote me on that. She was the best part of the episode. She was the driving force of it, more than any other one character. Obviously, I just said, well, it was split between 6 different subplots, but hers was the best, most prominent. That they've given her nice little scenes before, building her up, or the scouting thing they had in episode 3, but this is the first time Baela really got the screen time she needed to feel like a fully realized character with her own personality. Because she had 3 big scenes in this. She had a nice scene with Jace, then a really big scene mourning and discussing her grandmother with Rhaenyra, and then a huge scene with her grandfather Corlys convincing him to be her hand of the queen, rejoin the fight, which Corlys has never had a scene with his granddaughter before on camera. The best drama's rooted in family, and actually having interaction between them and what her personality is, and, well, I am a Targaryen, I'm betrothed to be Jace's queen, and mine is the Iron Throne, so I can't be your heir, but thanks for the gesture. Because Jace and her are getting the throne instead of Driftmark, they already discussed that. So, working that out, her dynamics with Jace, that they're both this co-equal couple, that they're both the older child who had to step up to be the adult and the parent died, the parallels of that. This was Baela's episode. There was significant development, the actress is great, and just overall well executed, and this is the screen time and plot development that we needed for her. To a lesser extent, but still welcome, is her younger sister Rhaena, who again hadn't talked for a long time until her first 2 speaking scenes in episode 3. Now, officially, it's Rhaena as a POV character. That this isn't, well, from Rhaenyra's perspective, she's talking to Rhaena or sending her off. That was episode 3. The only familiar character in this eerie scene was Rhaena. Sorry, it's weird that this wasn't a fully narrativized book, Fire and Blood, so I keep trying to figure out who would be the POV characters, the POV narrator for the chapters in the unwritten book this was supposed to be. Like a Daemon would be obviously the POV narrator if they narrativized the Reach subplot. You'd be seeing it through his eyes, or Daemon is presented as the POV character for the Harrenhal subplot. Now Jace is being the POV when he goes to this would be a Jace chapter with the twins or something, but this would be a Rhaena narrated chapter, POV chapter at the Eyrie, briefly. So they're actually giving her stuff to do. Like I said, I watched this scene a couple of times. I liked all the nuance that when it just every little line and gesture thought went into, because it was an acting scene, not an action scene. And the thought that it was, I know people just watch this and move on. I'm looking at the meaning and the inflection and way and choice of words they said everything. This was a really well done scene. They haven't really introduced Jane Eyre that much yet, though, so I'm going to hold off on that until another video. It wasn't meant to be the full Jane Eyre introduction. This was just early setup for, like Adam and Alan, similarly. We haven't given their full backstory yet, or Craig and Stark, but that's coming. One thing I did want to briefly touch on, though, I thought it was so weird that people thought Jane was being rude when she's entirely justified. Rhaenyra promised a war-capable dragon to fend off if the Greens sent a dragon, and instead she sent 2 hatchlings and her children and a couple of eggs, is going back on her word. Like, of course she'd be upset, and what are we going to do? Send you? We have a limited number of riders. If we send you one, we couldn't cover Dragonstone. But this is something a rational person would bring up. But she isn't yelling at Rhaena, and that when Rhaena says, look, it wasn't my decision, I'm powerless here, she understands, look, I'm angry at Rhaenyra, not you. So she has a pet the dog moment where she's nice and goes, oh, come to dinner, and I'm sorry your grandmother died. I got all of that and thought this is showing Jane as she's not a pushover, she's a good politician, that I'm not just going to get shorted like that, but that she's a nice person. She doesn't blame Rhaena for this. What was weird to me is I saw people not just thinking she was being unjustifiably rude, but more than one person in reaction videos independently thought that this was that Jane was insulting her by flippantly informing her for the first time that her grandmother was dead. That made no sense to me. That, like, people thought you went, oh, and by the way, sorry, we just got news your grandmother is dead. That would be an insult, but this isn't just because this is the first time we're seeing Rhaena being told that on camera doesn't mean she wasn't informed off camera. I mean, by that logic, we never saw when Baela or Corlys first received the news that she's dead. We see a couple of days after that when they're still upset about it. I mean, think about it. If this was the first time that Rhaena was hearing Rhaenys, her grandmother, had died, and Jane went, by the way, sorry your grandmother's dead, she wouldn't just stay silent as Jane walked out of the room. She'd go, wait, what? Care to explain that? Care to expand on that? Are you saying my grandmother is dead? The fact that Rhaena doesn't ask about it means this isn't the first time she's hearing that. No, this was Jane honestly saying, look, I'm annoyed, but I'm not annoyed at you, and, you know, pet the dog moment, and I'm sorry that your grandmother is dead, by the way. You have my sympathies. She meant that genuinely. So it's weird that I saw more than one person getting that impression. I don't blame the show, because, like, it's a short scene. I don't know what other context they could have given, but hopefully there'll be more scenes. We know it's going to be there's going to be more Rhaena scenes next episode. I hope that people don't get the wrong impression about Jane Eyre. That's just one of those weird things where, like that whole thing of the dress, is it gold, is it blue, that some people looked at this and thought, oh, Jane is rude and mean, and no, she isn't. She's actually taking Rhaena under her wing. But okay, we got significant stuff with Baela, with Rhaena, and even Jace. Jace got some nice stuff in the premiere, but last few episodes he's been stuck at the Dragonstone Council. And they sort of lampshade that here, with Jace complaining, I've been stuck on Dragonstone for a couple of episodes for my safety. And they outright invented that little subplot of him flying to the twins to treat with the Freys. Doesn't happen in the books at all, but, well, stuff happens through correspondence, written correspondence, that you can say in a book he was exchanging letters with lords. That in a TV show you need to actually depict that. For this and for other things where I said, oh, it makes sense that showing people in meetings works better in a TV show, that you can't just have letters. And it is part of the storyline of that they need the Winter Wolves, the Stark army, to come through the twins, so he's laying the groundwork to speed that along. That it wasn't just nostalgia of, hey, cool, it's the twins again. This is showing Jace actually being an effective politician, which he does become in the book. They say he steps up, and as the eldest, he has to grow up fast in war, that he steps up to become this effective leading politician in the war. And that with an entirely invented seat, it's not like they have the benefit, like Benioff and Weiss did, of just copy a chapter verbatim. These writers invented a scene that was true to the spirit of the book and conveyed that story point about Jace pretty well, while also conveying the story and army movements. And this is very silly. With zero evidence, I had this bad feeling that something was going to happen that didn't. I kept getting the feeling that the whole idea of, in the book, the idea of let's find people of Targaryen blood who don't have the name Targaryen. Eventually they look for just bastards who might have Targaryen blood. In the book, that was Jace's idea. And with zero evidence, I kept dreading, are they going to give this to Rhaenyra herself to concentrate the story more on the main character? Or are they going to give the idea to Baela to give her more to do or something? That mostly Rhaenyra, I kept fearing that they'd truncate Jace as a character by taking that away from him. So when I watched it, the scene at the end of the library where, no, that's pretty much what the book would have done, where it's Jace who comes up with the idea of, well, let's look for other people of Targaryen blood, just grinning. Because I was so convinced, for no reason, I was convinced that they take that away from Jace and give it to Rhaenyra or something. So this was also a pretty significant Jace episode. We saw him being a politician. We saw him coming up with the idea of where are we going to get other dragon riders. Couple that with, and overlapping with Baela. He had a scene with Baela. Team Velaryon was doing pretty well in this episode, those four. Again, really nice that we finally got a scene between Baela and her grandfather, Corlys. Some people felt Corlys was shorted by this. I felt he had a really big, powerful scene with Baela, and that was worth it. Yes, they cut that in the book. There's a point where he's really yelling at Rhaenyra about that. Well, why didn't you go instead of Rhaenys? But because she was incapacitated from her miscarriage. But the TV version is simply different. That they show at the council, all three of them are present, and Rhaenys saying, "No, you stay here. I volunteer to go." And even then, Corlys is still a little upset at her in the TV version of, oh, what? She thinks making me hand will compensate me for my wife's death in this war. That there's a little of that in there, but the outright yelling of the book version wouldn't have made sense because the context is different. There's a little he's in mourning but comes around. So I still felt he had a strong thing. Great acting from Steve Duscent. They said that thing of the one tear rolling out down his cheek in the opening scene when he's alone on his throne, that was purely ad-libbed by the actor. Well, just that isn't scripted. They told him he'd have to cry a single tear. He just knew to do that, because he's a good actor. So overall, Team Velaryon, this was the worry after the first half of the season, and already, start of the second half, episode 5, all four Velaryons got pretty big scenes and things to do. So that's addressing what was my one worry so far. 0.4 out of 7. Rhaenyra and Alicent's parallel storylines of both their small councils overlooking them because they are women. This wasn't the A-plot of the episode in either of them, but they were well done. The issue I want to discuss here is, was this hitting us over the head with the patriarchy stuff? Anvilicious, as they say, ham-fisted, and rewatching the episode a few times, I honestly don't think so. I mean, this is logically what would come up, and just, I'm remembering going back into the season, back into the origin of the series, season 1, people not very familiar with it saw, the basic description that, oh, we're going to be seeing some woke Hollywood thing hitting us over the head with the patriarchy, bad. When they saw the description for episode 1 is Rhaenyra is the first female heir to the throne and everything, but then when they got, I'm not going to name names, but when these specific reviewer channels actually watched the first few episodes, I would check their reviews, and they came around and said, it made sense in context. I mean, okay, like Angry Joe, I'll say, because he was basing it on the trailers, and I've cited him before as someone who really came around in his first few reviews and said, I was worried, but it made sense completely, and he came to really like the show and praise it. But him and a lot of other people just, it is about she's the first female heir, but in context, it wasn't bashing us over the head. It's what the story is. That the king's wife suddenly dies in childbirth, his younger brother's a maniac, so a lot of lords go, well, name your daughter your heir. We'd rather have her, and that it flowed organically. And it's kind of what the story is, so that it wasn't blatant. Like, I think the thing is speechifying. If people were giving really long, self-indulgent speeches about, oh, I'm stuck in this because I'm a woman in the world of men, it was like a 2-minute speech. That would be self-indulgent, versus, I think the issue is show, not tell, and I think they did that well. That they mentioned, oh, they're doing this because I'm a woman, but so much of it's just presenting it rather than self-indulgent speeches. So I'm fine with that. And it's balanced. That was the other thing that I really felt made it work, that this wasn't self-indulgent in this episode, is to then have Rhaenyra in private to Mysaria in the library. She actually admits, they have a point, I was never given formal instruction in military topics like them. Even though none of us have war experience, they've at least had, like instruction from books in terms of military strategy, siegecraft, or the basic logistical planning that goes into assembling an army. I really don't know any of that. Is a good point. Well, it's not just because we don't like you, but we can measurably say you don't have the required instruction in these topics. None of us have real life experience. You don't even have the instruction. And the Alicent one hit harder, though. I mean that in a good way, hit harder. That she was already the formerly ruling regent in the last couple of years when her husband was bedridden. That she has experience at rule, and they go, well, yeah, rule in peacetime. And you don't know as much about war planning, or that Larys points out, our entire claim is based on that Rhaenyra should be passed over because she's a woman. Many of our allies might abandon us if we then are led by a woman ourselves. It's not just we don't like you, but there are practical reasons. And you can argue that the system is flawed and against them, but it's still, they're not mustache-twirling villains. Ha ha, patriarchy, bad. But look, whether it's right or not, you haven't had the training that you need to do this. So they're not cartoon characters. And even then, like, they still listen to Rhaenyra on the Black Council. They disagree with her, versus the way they filmed that Green Council thing, that as soon as they shut down Alicent, no, Aemond is regent, they are just talking past her, and she's totally silent and ignoring her. That's the whole show, not tell thing. That's above and beyond. Well, they could say, well, we'll nominally have Aemond be the official regent, but we still value your words. She can't even get a word in edgewise. Like, that's on them. That is part of the system. That, like, Robb Stark still valued his own mother's diplomatic experience enough that she was prominently in all of his war councils. That, okay, make Aemon the nominal regent. There's a difference between that and simply ignoring me completely at the table. Not part of the discussion. So, I feel that this walked a fine line, but wasn't hitting us over the head, and was something that would naturally come up in the plot. That was this hitting us over the head with the glass ceiling for women. I feel they handled it realistically, so I'm not complaining. And not even not complaining. Like, I say, oh, well, Rhaenyra sneaking in to have a face-to-face meeting with Alicent that could have been through letters in the book. I'm not complaining. This, I felt, worked and was true to the source, true to the context, true to the source material. I think that worked out. Moving on. 0.5 out of 7. This is short. The small folk storyline, which includes both Hugh the Smith and Mysaria. Because you see Hugh in the suffering of the small folk, then Mysaria saying, we're going to take advantage of that and rile up the commoners in King's Landing. They send Olinda. The quick point here is, I like how this was moving along at a very quick pace. And this specific part of the small folk storyline isn't dragging at all. When people go, some parts of Season 2 might be dragging, this is not one of them. That we were afraid it would, but it isn't. That, consider, Hugh has only had 2 short scenes before this. This is his 3rd scene. First episode, petitioning the king, great scene, everyone liked it. It was with Aegon and Otto. After that, he had exactly one scene, under 2 minutes, very succinctly establishing food prices are drastically rising because of the blockade, he hasn't been paid, and he has a very sick child. Like, some people complained about that in episode 3, and it's like, it's one short 2-minute scene, and it's giving context for the small folk as a whole. I guess it's because people don't know who Hugh is, Hugh becomes a major character, we'll see that later. But in terms of that, I didn't feel that dragged at all in episode 3, I don't feel it drags now. For a minute there, I was afraid it would. When they're in his home discussing things are getting really bad now, because I thought, oh, are we going to have one or maybe two more scenes repeating this in episode 6 and 7? No. Because then by the end of the episode, they have another scene with Hugh showing they're not dragging out just, and here's Hugh in his house again. No, they show him trying to leave the city with his family as refugees, and that Aemon shut the gates to keep people from abandoning it. And that was a pretty well filmed thing. It's hard to film large crowds. They built a nice exterior set. So, point is, Hugh's storyline is, I hope, to the average viewer, visibly already moving forward. That he's trapped in the city, that things are really bad now. It's not just, oh, things are bad. Things are reaching ahead. And we see in the trailers there's going to be a big food riot next episode. So, if you think some storylines are spinning their wheels, know that the small folk thing has been actually moving at a pretty good pace. And succinctly, and I'm enjoying that. I'd like to see Ulf again, just because I like the tavern set and everything. That was also nice. 0.6 out of 7, though. The one storyline that I would say was a little slow. Daemon and the Riverlands storyline. I'll say right now, I did not dislike this in episode 5. But it was relatively the weakest part of the episode. Relatively speaking to the rest of it. That's not a criticism. Particularly because the Harrenhal stuff was amazing in the past 2 episodes. First, when episode 3, when Daemon goes there, has a really good dialogue with Simon Strong, and then meeting Alice Rivers, our first big meeting with her in episode 4, also very interesting. This episode, not as much. But, I've rewatched this multiple times, and the big point I want to convey here is, I can't think of anything to actually cut from this, that every scene conveyed something. And there wasn't something that was redundant to the point I thought, oh, they should have cut this, it would have been the same episode. It wouldn't. Well, first off, the thing a lot of people were reacting to the past 2 days was, oh, they have Daemon having a nightmare where it turns out he's having sex with his mother. And, guys, a creepy witch has been sending Daemon disturbing nightmares. And you're surprised that the witch sent him another disturbing nightmare. It's supposed to be upsetting. Like last episode, he cut his wife's head off in a dream with a sword. And if anything, I think in terms of the tropes of haunted house sending you creepy nightmares, sex with mother or sex with zombie, like in The Shining, are cliches. I mean, they said we based a lot of this is inspired by The Shining. They said for Harrenhal, it's this haunted, old, half-abandoned castle. If anything, the only thing I was mildly annoyed about is we have good physical descriptions for his mother, Alyssa, from the book, and she doesn't look like this. I mean, she has heterochromia, each eye a different color, and not even getting into that she has this broken nose from, she's a tomboy, she got it broken in a training fight. I understand, face bones, you go with the actors you have, but would it have killed you to have an actor put in fake color contacts just as an Easter egg to show, oh look, she has heterochromia like she does in the book? It felt like not paying attention, so I wasn't complaining, oh, his mother, why doesn't look like his mother from the book, the details of that, but creepy witch sending him disturbing dreams. This is kind of on point for what they're going for with that. And some people are just looking for... I pause here. I think some people have been... I've noticed the past 5 episodes, every time every episode came, some people were looking for a new controversy to declare that this is the season breaker. And then it would always pass after a few days, like, oh, the... Blood and Cheese wasn't as violent as in the book. Well, it kind of shouldn't have been. There were practical reasons you couldn't do that with kids. That was a real complaint, but just then it turned into, oh, this episode was, if nothing else, this was slow, or the Rhaenyra Allison thing is the worst thing since the Sansa raid. No. Just people were looking. Yeah, there were things that were relatively the low point of a given episode, were not season scale controversies because by the next episode we weren't really yelling about them anymore. Me, the other big book analysis channels, there haven't really been anything on the level of like Rhaenys crashing through the floorboards at King's Landing, and in episode 9, and even then they did explain in the next episode, well, I don't want to start a war and draw first blood. I think they should have either put that in the same episode or aired them back to back, but that's really the worst thing so far. Nothing has matched that, and even that we survived. So, oh, he had sex with his mother in a nightmare, like, people are looking for other things. I think the bigger thing people are going to discuss after the season is over is toning down Blood and Cheese a little, which I agreed with. It would just scared away general audiences. That that comes up for like 2 days. People have short attention spans, and then it fades. And even that, the plot thing was messing with how he always felt he was the favorite son, and why wasn't he the heir, and stuff like that. But that didn't really drag down the episode for me, other than, dude, color contacts for your eyes. No, because it was short. The only thing I felt was slow was specifically the long discussion he has with Alice Rivers as they're repairing the main hall and he's walking around and talking. And part of this is they wanted to show how much of the set they built. And more importantly, they wanted Daemon using her as a sounding board for this is where his mental state is now. Again, rewatching it, I wouldn't know what lines of dialogue to cut. It is conveying things. But it was more about Daemon than it was about Alice, whereas last episode was all about who is this Alice Rivers mysterious woman. So that was a bit long, but the other parts were fine, of when they're at the dinner thing where they're discussing local place names and where are we going to get supplies. And then the very last scene was really good, where I like when they introduce new sets of characters, particularly political rulers who represent an entire region, that we have 4 new Riverlord characters come in to confront him, and they all have names in the credits, like Lady Mallister, Lord Darry, places we haven't seen before. So really treating the Riverlands as this full region. So that was great. And again, if you thought this was dragging, we know from leaks that by episode 7, Daemon will be overseeing the assembling Riverlord army at Harrenhal, that by episode 7 they come to his side. This is his darkest hour, the end of episode 5. He's going to do something really cool and awesome in episode 6 to win them over. I don't know what, we have no idea. But we see him, like, dressed in traveling clothes, heading to Caraxes in the trailer. Is he gonna go get a bank loan from the Iron Bank? Is he gonna kill Willem Blackwood to appease them? Is he gonna do both? I don't know. But again, like the small folk thing, this isn't, it's interminable. We can see from the trailers that whatever they're doing with this subplot will reach a head by next episode, so I don't consider it dragging as such. And there's nothing I'd obviously cut. I mean, it's slow, but I wouldn't know how to fix it. Fix it is a strong word. Another side note here. Simon Russell Beale is, of course, amazing as Simon Strong, and I've seen, when he first was introduced in episode 3, I saw more than one person say he reminds me of John Bradley as Sam Tarley. I didn't see it at the time, just in terms of his physical appearance, whatever. This episode, yes, very blatantly and obviously, not in his appearance, but in his physical mannerisms. Cadence of his speech, his inflections, all of that. This was too specific to be a coincidence. And the character isn't related to Sam Tarley. I don't think the actor is related. How do we explain this? I think the simple answer is that, Simon Russell Beale is actually a very famous British actor in stage theater. That this is like, I live in New York City, but I don't really go to Broadway plays a lot, that there can be a very famous actor on the Tony Award circuit for live theater, but they're not in international films, so you don't know them as well as like Matt Smith or something. That I think that the answer is Simon Russell Beale. He's considered one of the top 5 living British actors, they must just run his clips a lot at British acting schools. Much as, like, Peter O'Toole or Ian McKellen's Richard III, like, these were influential actors. Obviously, younger actors would even unconsciously base their performances on them. I wouldn't even blame them for that. And let me make this clear, like, I don't like John Bradley. I consider him a sellout, that he kept praising Benioff and Weiss to get work, but I wouldn't blame him for this. Oh, you ripped off Russell Beale. No, they must have been running a lot of training footage of Beale's performances at whatever acting school that Bradley went to. So this is sort of like saying, oh, that guy, I mean, the Aemond actor, Ewan Mitchell, said, I'm actually basing a lot of my performance on Peter O'Toole's work when he was playing scary characters. So it's just influential actors, that it's not that he's copying John Bradley. It's John Bradley must have based a lot of his acting career on his work, and I'm fine with that. It's just, you can see how this really is a famous actor that, not in movies, but among actor schools, they would have seen his work a lot, which is just interesting. Anyway, moving along from that. That was a little slow, and I know, I'm sorry I'm circling around here. I'm late, I was sick, I know I'm already an hour into this. Point 7. Cinematography, just because I'd like to keep that up there, and I was struggling to think of other things to talk about. Point 7 is I like the other cinematography in this. Claire Kilner's my favorite director on the show so far, though I like them all. That she did episode 2, better stuff in there, but still good stuff in here. That, I've stressed this before, different directors have more freedom to choose to stress different things that are part of the overall cinematography style of this show. Whereas Game of Thrones didn't have a cinematography style and stifled it of, no, we need nothing but tight close-ups. This show has POV shots, Steadicam follow-throughs, crane shots, and wide shots like a movie. That's what their style is. Geeta Patel stressed Steadicam a little more and crane shots. Taylor did wide shots a bit more. Kilner, and they have done the other things too, but Kilner is really good at working in these POV shots that are not intrusive, where Patel, it'll be like this sweeping POV Steadicam thing through the streets that you realize this is a camera. Kilner's stuff is subtle enough you don't consciously think, oh, I'm looking through a camera, but it is, that you're looking from someone's POV. And there's two ways to do a POV. Either the camera is pointed at a character, but you're still, it's to reflect their headspace. Like if they're feeling confined, it's a tighter close-up to make them feel stressed. Or you literally have the camera supposed to be looking through the eyes of someone else. They've done that more rarely, but they did it in this episode. To show how weirded out Daemon is from the potion hallucinations. When he comes out of it and he's at the dinner table, notice that they use direct POV shots. Not just that the camera isn't pointed at Matt Smith, we're looking through his eye, the camera is his eye, as he turns to Simon, and then he turns to his grandson who offers him some more of the goose. That we're looking right out of the camera at them very briefly, and it's jarring, just to get this subconscious sense of how jarring this haunted castle is. And there are other good things in this episode, like the match cuts that she did from, like, Daemon leaning against a fireplace to Rhaenyra leaning against a fireplace, also struggling with leadership, all of that stuff. But then you have there's other things she did, but the other thing to conclude on is that really great POV thing with Alicent at the Green Council, which is the other way to do a POV shot, where it is pointed at her, but it's reflecting her headspace. This slow zoom in, and I'm arguing that this isn't these performances, these faces, like on Game of Thrones, that even though Alicent isn't talking, there is a lot of dialogue in it as she's hearing everyone else, and their dialogue is muffled as we're seeing her perspective, we're hearing her perspective, that we suddenly start hearing her hyperventilating. When was the last time did Game of Thrones ever even do that? I don't know. That it was a perspective shot where we're in her headspace of how isolated she feels. That was pretty new. Zooming in, that it's the type of POV where we're not looking through her eyes, but the camera's pointed at her, reflecting, I am isolated and panicking now. That was pretty good. That, looking ahead, We're going to have two new directors in episode 6 and 7. Andriy Perek is directing episode 6. He was a award-winning director from Succession. And then Lonnie Perister, so we'll see if they bring a different visual style to their episodes. That I like what Kilner has done. I'm surprised Perek is doing the Street Riot. Because up till now, Kilner has really been the go-to person for street scenes. That only 2 episodes in season 1 had street scenes. Episode 4, when Rhaenyra goes to Flea Bottom, and then episode 9, when they're chasing after Aegon. She did both of those. And now this season, Kilner's directed the big funeral progress for Jaehaerys, young Jaehaerys, in episode 2. She directed that. And now she's directed the, I guess, morbid parallel funeral progress for Melissa's head, the dragon head, also Kilner. So Perek will be the first time we're getting a big street scene by someone who isn't Kilner. Because it's a riot, it's an action scene, and they talked about behind-the-scenes videos. We built this big multi-street set for the alleyways immediately around the Red Keep gates, specifically so they can have this riot scene, because they alluded to, we can't have action scenes and riots in the streets of Caceres. It's a historic site, and they don't want us to damage it, so we needed to build a stage set for it at Leavesden Studios for the purposes of the riots and stuff, which makes sense. So that's what Perek will be doing next episode, and yes, the small folk subplot is coming to a head, and this riot is an invention of the TV show. But it's what would happen. Like, it's obviously reflecting what happens in the novels, obviously Clash of Kings, with the full-scale food riot, which season 2 of Game of Thrones tried to show a bit. I'm hoping this is a lot closer to that. Of when King's Landing is blockaded, obviously there are going to be food riots. So, those are the top 7 points. This is a setup episode. This is good for a setup episode. New writers need to cut their teeth on it. This expanded out to the most locations and subplots we've had so far on this show. I hope we see more, because I want, like, the Starks and Aarons to be characters. But point 3, the Velaryons finally got their due in this episode. That now that it's the second half of the season, first episode of the second half of the season now, those other plots are out of the way, the 4 Velaryon characters I felt were underserved suddenly got a lot of focus, so all is well. Rhaenyra and Alicent's parallel storylines, I don't think we're hitting us over the head with that. The small folk storyline is moving at a good pace. Daemon's Riverlands thing, there was like one scene I thought was a bit slow with Alice, but I wouldn't know how to cut it down. But Alice will be in next episode too. There's promo photos of her holding an owl. The owls are not what they seem, you know. And the cinematography with Kilner I really liked. Again, after the season, on a scale of weeks and months, I'm going to be picking apart the cinematography throughout the seasons on this show, because it's really good. Those are the 7 points. I'm sorry I didn't have time to script this out better, but again, I was sick. I'm throwing this together at the last minute. I will have a better handle on things next week. This is just better than nothing, but concluding the highs and lows of the episode, well, like I said, the lows was the Alice Daemon scene, which was necessary but didn't add that much. My personal favorites, I guess, were Baela and Corlys, Jace and the twins, Rhaena and Jane Arryn. Plus the small council scenes. Small council scenes are always great. So that's where we stand right now. Also, I was able to script out a lot of lore videos while I was sick. I wasn't idle, I couldn't record, so I made like 30 videos of 10 minutes each. I made little videos. Instead of making one big hour video, I split it up by internal chapter. And I'm going to be releasing those in batches in the coming week or two, to get it out while season 2 is still airing when most people are watching. But I have not been idle. I have been busy working on short-form lore videos in the 10-minute range. So please like and subscribe. If you like doing the Patreon thing, enough people asked, I made a Patreon. I have to update that. And I will be joining you for when hopefully things come to a head next episode. Because we don't know a lot about episode 6, other than that there's going to be riots in it. Daemon will do something to win the Riverlords back over. And we'll actually see the Lannister army at Golden Tooth, which they've been mentioning every episode up till now. Let's see if they introduce new characters with that.